following the 50s and early 60s, and especially following the assassination of Verwoerd, you would think that this resistance would have been suppressed to such an extent that people would have no voice. And here we start to see the rise of a different kind of organization or thinking around this kind of oppression. We see again a further crystallization of white power, perhaps with the Black Homeland Citizens Act of 1970, where people were no longer citizens of South Africa, and they were the link to the formation of these Bantustans was crystallized even further. But we also see the emergence of Black consciousness in the 70s, particularly I'm thinking of the work of Steve Biko. And we see resistance against many of these acts. Think about the Bantu Education Act and the Soweto uprising in 1976. So at the same time that we have this oppression, we have different forms of resistance coming from young people with a different emphasis. Perhaps we could talk a little bit about that, and maybe we can think particularly around 1977, where two very important things happened. We see the murder of Steve Biko, the tragedy around the end of his life, and the complicity of the medical fraternity in his death. But we also see a new Health Act that comes into place in 1977. So, and the consequences of that act that further creates fragmentation, not only in people of color, but within white communities itself. So I find this a very interesting period. Would you talk a little bit more to that?
It's an absolutely fascinating period. Between the late 60s and about 1973, there's this slowly evolving new dialectic emerging. You've got a lot of ideological pressure coming from Pretoria across the country through censorship and through very rigid controls over schooling and over the public sphere, over what we would call the airways, radio. By the way, you might be interested to know the South African government had the technology to allow television to develop in the country, but they decided to control it until they could really refine it. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So you've got radio, television, radio, newspapers, the movement of text such as essay writing, books that are allowed to be published and produced, and all forms of schooling, highly censored, even right up to university level in the country. So there's sort of thought control. You've got the banning of all of these parties. But there's one area, Stephen, the South African government is wary about stepping into, whether it's in so-called South Africa after it became a republic, and then, as you pointed out, in 1970, stripping Black South Africans of their citizenship in that republic and making them citizens of other places, whilst still in this complicated way allowing colored and Indian people to be citizens, something they later tackle. So you've got this very, very interesting control, even into the Bantustans, and certainly in South Africa, of people's thoughts and of their ability to express themselves, and huge amounts of power being given to censorship bodies. Whilst that's going on, one area they're very wary to step into, issues of faith. One thing we haven't tackled in these history lectures yet is how the National Party declared themselves to be a Christian national government. In that, they were not just performing a kind of act of faith in their Protestant Calvinist approach to life. They were declaring that South Africa's decisions about, for example, segregation were God-shaped decisions. And this is one of the reasons why the World Councils of Churches and that really began to push against this form of Christian interpretation. It also, as you can imagine, Stephen, extremely radicalized Christians who didn't agree. So quite a large number, I mean, still a minority, but a fairly large number of white Christians began to really question whether they believed that Christian Nationalist Party of South Africa was a Christian party. And you see the beginning of that movement of priests, of pastors, of people in the white Christian community beginning to question, including Afrikaans-speaking Calvinist members of Calvinist churches, very, very famously people like Beers Noder and others. You also see the beginning of questioning amongst Black South African Christians. The majority of Christians in the country at that point are Black South Africans, and about 85% of Black South Africans by the 70s, late 60s, were professing Christians. So it's the majority religion. And Black South Africans, even if they're asking it quietly in their churches and out of the ear of the government censors, they are beginning to question this link vociferously, and they're looking for Christian resources in the world to build on. So there's a very powerful movement that comes up from Latin America and other places which highly influenced Stephen Bantu Biko and the people around him who went to medical school at this Black segregated medical school in Durban, the Natal Medical School, the only medical school in the country at the time, allowed for Black South Africans, and they couldn't quite divide Indian and colored people off because they didn't have other resources. So they were trying to force so-called colored and Indian and Black South Africans all to study medicine and pharmacology and allied disciplines in Durban at this one medical school. At this medical school, there were people of different faiths, people who came from Hindu backgrounds, Muslim South Africans, socialist South Africans, but the majority of people studying at this medical school were Christian. And they were some of the most intelligent, well-motivated people. And they came from all over the country, Stephen, because there wasn't a separate medical school yet for Xhosas or for Vendors or for Tswanas. So people from all different parts of the country who'd grown up in Soweto, who'd grown up in the northern part of Polokwane, who'd grown up on the eastern seaboard, who grew up in the Cape, who grew up in the interior, they all came. And they were often the most intelligent, widely read people from their own communities with a whole lot of aspirations, with a huge amount of hope invested in them by their families, by their parents, by the communities that had sent them to this. They came to this medical school, and one of the texts that they could draw on over and over for inspiration was the Old and New Testament of the Christian faith. They sat and read it alongside Hindu South Africans, Muslim South Africans. They began to read the liberation theology and the philosophers informing the liberation theology movements of Latin America. They began to read some of the socialist thinkers, some of the existential thinkers from Europe, the people that had positioned themselves both against the capitalist Western system and against Soviet socialism. They were influenced by post-colonial thinkers. They were influenced by people from Tanzania, by the first people who liberated India. They began to read again the work of Gandhi, because after all, Gandhi had spent a lot of time in Durban, and then of course had gone back to India, and it helped to create India as a post-colonial society. They began to read the work of Kwame Nkrumah, of Julius Nyerere. They began to read the work of Kenyatta. They began to think of themselves as part of a Black diaspora. They began to read the work of Pan-Africanist writers. They began to read the work of people who'd been born in French colonies as well, translated into English, like César's work. They began to think and read outside of the Baas Cup, the kind of boss mentality of the white South African state. And the vehicle for a lot of their thinking was Christianity. So it was very difficult for the South African government to clamp down on everything they were saying initially, because they weren't using the writings, say, of Karl Marx or Lenin. They were using the writings of the Christian faith. And Stephen Bantu Biko comes to prominence in that University of Natal environment because he is a Christian leader, and he helps to start, along with others, the Black Christians associations, which the government finds very difficult to ban, because after all, they begin and end every meeting with prayers, and they constantly invoke and call upon the testimony of Jesus Christ in their work. But gradually, the government begins to realize how dangerous this formation of young South Africans are, and they begin to infiltrate paid spies into these groups, which is a tactic, of course, that all authoritarian states use. And through the 1971, 72, 73 period, what absolutely terrifies authorities in Pretoria and in Pietermaritzburg, which is the provincial capital of the province of Natal, is the coming together in secret meetings and in prayer groups of the nascent trade union movement, which is building up again in the Durban harbour with the stevedores, which gets sort of shocked into a progressive movement by the 1973 oil strike. And as you've got the beginning of a secret illegal trade union movement amongst Black people beginning to arise, as they begin to make common cause with working class Indian people living in the city of Durban in the garment industry, for example, as these people begin to meet with highly educated medical students in the harbour area of Durban where the segregated medical school is, as they begin to form reading groups and writing groups and begin to circulate materials between one another. A lot of the names of famous South Africans, Stephen Bantu Biko, Mampela Rampela, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, Fred Khumalo, Zweli Mkhize, Pravin Gordon, Jerry Kovadia, Abdul Karim. These communities of people are beginning to talk to each other. And the government is getting extremely anxious. And they get even more anxious when this group of people meets up with some left-wing white students like Rick Turner, like people based at the University of Natal Howard College campus. And the government seeks to try and ban and control these people. And one of the ringleaders that they regard as incredibly intelligent, who's able to move across scientific and religious communities, who is a formidable and charismatic figure, and who's beginning to make links with people in exile, ANC members that have gone into border states such as Lesotho, but particularly into Zambia and into some of the states to the north, like Tanzania. He begins to see the way that Stephen Bantu Biko's Black consciousness movement, focusing on Black people forming self-help groups, focusing on Black people having a new view of their own lives and their own capacities, and particularly with the definition of Blackness as anybody who considers themselves outside of white power. So the potential to even include whites in Blackness as long as they reject the narratives of white Baas Cup. This extremely dynamic, very progressive, electrifying ideology, which is gripping the attention of Black youth in Durban, but increasingly also fanning out into Cape Town, Pietermaritzburg, the Pretoria townships, and of course the Vaal Triangle and around Johannesburg into Soweto. This terrifies the South African government. And when they see that people in the exiled ANC movement, people in London like Oliver Tambo, people inside of the exile community are starting to listen, even if they're quite skeptical at first of this Black consciousness movement, they get really, really scared, Stephen, and they really begin to hammer down on these communities of mixed trade union, student, medical student, religious groups and communities. And they really go after a number of key individuals, not only Stephen Bantu Biko, who we know so much about, but also they particularly also target women doctors, women nurses. There are a large number of South African women from the Indian community and the African community who also get attacked. They get harassed, their families get harassed, they get arrested on spurious charges. In the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which came about at the end of apartheid, harrowing narratives of what happened to some of these people. One of them is actually an intimate partner of Stephen Bantu Biko. Her name is Mampela Rampele. She escapes death, but she gets banished to a rural area. Winnie Mandela, living in Johannesburg, gets banished to a rural area. There's a huge amount of ferment